Before we begin, if you're new here, welcome. This channel tells stories of quiet strength, slow-burning love, and the kind of people who don't ask to be saved. If that's what you came for, hit like and subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now settle in. This one starts on a train platform with a woman holding a letter that wasn't meant for her. She came to return his letters but stayed to save his ranch, a Wyoming love story. The letter was not hers. Nora Calloway had read it so many times during the three-day journey west that the paper had softened along the folds, gone almost translucent, where her thumb had pressed over the same line again and again. I am a man of plain habits and plainer speech. I do not offer poetry. I offer a working life shared honestly in a place that asks everything of you and gives back what you earn. The signature at the bottom, Cade Morrow Sentinel Ridge Ranch, Carbon County, Wyoming Territory, was written in a hand as direct and unadorned as the words above it. Violet had underlined that line. Violet, who loved poetry and silk ribbons and the idea of wild country, the way people love paintings of storms from the safety of a well-lit room. The train lurched as it curved into Rawlins, and Nora tucked the letter back into her bag alongside its 37 companions, all in Violet's looping, breathless script, all addressed to a man her sister had never met. And all of them, every word, every carefully constructed impression, every whispered confidence about her hopes and her nature built around a woman who did not exist. Violet was not steady. Violet was not practical. Violet had never in her 23 years repaired a seam by lamplight or tallied a ledger column twice to find a 3-cent error, because 3 cents compounded over a year became $3, and $3 was a week of bread. Nora was 28, and she had done all of those things and many more besides, and none of them had ever been called remarkable by anyone. She'd looked out the window as the train slowed. The land out here was nothing like Ohio. Ohio had the comfortable curves of old country, soft hills, rivers that knew their banks, trees that clustered and sheltered. This was different. This was the high plain under a sky so enormous it seemed to press down. And the distances were not distances at all, but absences, vast and indifferent, punctuated only by the occasional dark smear of sage and the far-off suggestion of mountains still furred with last winter's snow. It was the kind of country that made Cincinnati feel like a dream you'd had in a warm bed. Nora pressed 2 fingers against the glass and watched a hawk hang motionless above a ridge, writing something invisible, not working and not resting, just being. She envied it briefly. Then the platform appeared and she picked up her bag and stood. The plan had been simple enough, as Violet had explained it through tears in the front parlor of their mother's house on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago. "I can't go," Violet had said. She had been beautiful even in distress, which had always seemed to Nora a kind of unfair advantage. "I simply cannot, Nora. I've met someone. Edmund. He's a clerk at Papa's old firm, and oh, Nora, he's wonderful, and if I leave now—" "Violet." Nora had set down the account she was reviewing. "You have been writing to this man in Wyoming for 8 months." "I know. He has written back faithfully. He paid for your train ticket." "I know. He is expecting you." Violet's chin had trembled in the precise way it had trembled since childhood, the particular tremor that had for 23 years reliably produced the result Violet required. "You could go, just to explain. Return the letters and the portrait and apologize. You're so much better at difficult conversations than I am, Nora. You know you are." "I'm not better at them, I simply do them." "Then you'll go." Nora had looked at her sister for a long moment. She thought about saying no. She thought about the shape of the word, its clean, single syllable. She had said it before to creditors and to the landlord, and to the man at the feed store who had tried to short their order. She was capable of it. "I'll wire when I arrive," she had said instead. "Send the return fare to the Western Union in Rawlins within 5 days. I'll be home in a fortnight." That had been 23 days ago. The wire had come 6 days after her arrival in Wyoming. Not money, but a message. "So happy, Nora," Edmund proposed. "Forgive me. We'll send funds when we're settled. You're so strong you'll manage." Nora had read the wire 3 times in the Rawlins telegraph office, then folded it in quarters and placed it in her pocket and walked back to the boarding house and sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the narrow room and done the arithmetic. $11.40 remained in her purse. A ticket back to Cincinnati cost $14. The boarding house charged 75 cents a night. She had been putting off the journey to Sentinel Ridge Ranch for 5 days already, hoping the funds would arrive before she had to face the man whose life her sister had disrupted. They were not going to arrive. So she had eaten a small breakfast, paid for 2 more nights in advance, and hired a wagon to drive her south toward the mountains. The ranch road came off the main trail at a junction marked by a weathered post bearing a painted board Sentinel Ridge. The letters faded but legible, and the driver had given her a look that suggested he found her destination either impressive or inadvisable, and had not elaborated. The approach took the better part of an hour. The land changed as they climbed the flat plain, giving way to rolling ground, the sage-thickening stands of pine appearing on the slopes above. The road was rough but well-maintained, the drainage cuts at the edges recently cleared. Someone kept this road. Someone paid attention to the small, preventable problems before they became large, unavoidable ones. Nora noticed this. She noticed most things of that kind. When the ranch itself came into view, she understood the name. The land here rose on 3 sides, steep ridges of pale sandstone and dark timber, forming a natural enclosure, the open side facing south toward a long valley where cattle moved like slow, dark punctuation across the grass. The buildings were substantial, the main house of squared logs, long and low, with a covered porch running the full front length, a barn of weathered board, several outbuildings in good repair, a bunkhouse from which the sound of voices carried faintly on the afternoon air. A working place, a place that had been thought about. She was still taking it in when she became aware that a man had emerged from the barn and stopped. He was watching the wagon approach with the stillness of someone who has learned that stillness itself is a form of information, that you learn more about a situation by waiting than by moving. He was tall, the kind of tall that didn't announce itself, but simply was like the ridgeline behind him. His hat was pushed back slightly, and even from this distance, Nora could see that his face was the face of a man who spent his days in weather, all plains and shadows, the soft parts of youth long since burned off by sun and wind, and something heavier than either. He didn't come forward when the wagon stopped. He waited for her to come to him. Nora climbed down without assistance and walked across the packed earth yard with her bag in her hand and the 37 letters pressing against her ribs through the leather. "Mr. Morrow," she said. He looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at her, which was with the mild indifference reserved for furniture that was serviceable but unremarkable. He looked at her the way she imagined he'd looked at weather coming in from the north, with complete attention and no particular expression. "You're not her," he said. His voice was low, worn smooth by disuse or wind or both. "No," Nora said. "I'm her sister. My name is Nora Calloway. Violet sends her profound regrets, and I've come to return your correspondence and your portrait." She reached into her bag and withdrew the packet of letters tied with Violet's ribbon. "I understand this is a significant inconvenience, and I'm sorry for it." Cade Morrow looked at the packet. He did not reach for it. He looked back at her face. "Violet," he said, as if testing the name. "Yes, my sister." She described herself as patient, practical. Said she'd spent 2 years managing her family's household accounts after her father died. Nora was quiet for a moment. "Those were my qualities," she said, and she borrowed them. Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't have said what. "She wrote about hands," he said. "Said hers were always working." Nora looked down at her own hands, still holding the packet of letters. The scar across the right knuckle from a scissors accident at 11. The roughened skin at the fingertips from years of handling fabric and paper. The callus at the base of the index finger from the pen. "Those are also mine," she said. There was a silence that felt like the moment before a door closes. "I've got 20 years of ranch records in boxes in the study," Cade Morrow said. "The man who kept the books before me did it wrong, and I've known it for 6 years, but I haven't had the time or the learning to fix it." Nora waited. "I need someone to go through those boxes, find what's wrong, set it straight." He looked past her toward the South Valley. "I need someone who can do that kind of work, someone who can run a household and handle themselves when the weather turns." "You're offering me employment," she said. "Trial employment, 1 month. If it works, we discuss terms. If it doesn't, I'll pay your return fare when the supply wagon goes to Rollins in 4 weeks. 4 weeks. Nora did the arithmetic automatically. She was $9 short of a ticket home, even if she spent nothing. She was as precisely as if the tide had gone out around her stranded. And she realized with a cold and curious clarity, not entirely reluctant. "I am not Violet," she said. "I want that to be clear." "It's clear. I'm older and considerably less agreeable. I have no talent for making a place feel welcoming. I can make it function. Function is what I need." She looked at him, really looked the way she had learned to look at accounts that might be hiding something. She saw tiredness carried so long it had become structural. She saw the careful blankness of a man who has decided not to want things because wanting costs too much. She recognized that. She had worn it herself for a long time. 1 month, she said, as your employee. Nothing further implied or intended. Agreed. He picked up her trunk and carried it toward the house, and Nora followed. The woman who opened the door before they reached it was perhaps 60, with dark hair gone iron gray, and braided rather than pinned, and eyes that were the particular black of deep water. She wore a work apron over a dress of deep blue wool, and she looked at Nora with an attention that was both warmer and more measuring than Cade's. Ruth, Cade said, not slowing his stride. Miss Calloway will be in the East Room. She'll be handling the ranch records. Ruth said nothing. She held the door, let Cade pass, and then looked at Nora with an expression Nora could not immediately read. I'll show you the room, Ruth said. Her voice had a cadence that was not quite the cadence of English as a first language. Something older and more deliberate underneath it. Inside the house was clean and spare. Heavy, plain furniture built for use rather than appearance. No curtains, only shutters. No rugs. No pictures. On the mantel above the stone fireplace, a single object, a small painted ceramic pitcher, blue and white, slightly incongruous, against the rough stone the way a song is incongruous when it starts in a place you didn't expect it. The East Room was small and simply furnished a bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall, a window looking toward the eastern ridge. Clean, private. The outhouse is behind the garden, Ruth said from the doorway. Pump is on the north side. Breakfast is at 5:30. 5:30, Nora repeated. He's gone before first light. Eats fast. Ruth paused. You're not what he was expecting. No, I know. Are you what you look like? It was a strange question. Nora turned from the window. That depends on what I look like. Someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, Ruth said, and has gotten so used to it she doesn't know she's still carrying it. Nora said nothing. Ruth nodded as if something had been confirmed. 5:30, she said again and went back up the hallway, leaving Nora alone with the window and the sound of the wind beginning in the pines. She began with the kitchen, not because she had been asked to. Cade's instructions had been limited to the ranch records, but because you earned your place in any household by first understanding how it worked, and you understood how it worked by seeing what it needed. The kitchen needed order. It was clean but inefficient, the stores arranged without logic, the pantry divided by whoever had last used it rather than by any system. Nora spent the morning of her first full day reorganizing the dry goods, labeling the tins in her careful handwriting, noting what was low. Ruth watched this from the doorway for perhaps 10 minutes without speaking, then came in and began preparing the noon meal, and the two women worked around each other in a silence that felt, after the first hour, less like absence of conversation, and more like a particular kind of conversation that didn't need words. In the afternoon, Nora went to the study. The boxes were as Cade had described, 6 of them stacked against the far wall, filled with ledger books, loose receipts, cattle tallies, water rights, documentation, tax records, correspondence, going back to the founding of the ranch. Years of paper, years of numbers, years of a life being built, some of it carefully kept, some of it done in haste by a man who had too much land and not enough hours. She sat down and opened the first ledger book. An hour into it, she found the first discrepancy. Stock numbers from 3 years ago that corresponded to a bill of sale recording a different count. Not large 12 head of cattle, over 3 years at prevailing prices, roughly $240. She set it aside and kept reading. She found 2 more irregularities before the light failed. When Cade came in after dark, smelling of horses and cold and the sharp mineral smell of the high country, she was waiting in the kitchen with Ruth. He ate standing up, not from rudeness, she understood, but from habit, the body still half outside in the work of the day. The ranch records, Nora said. She had her notes on the table. I've found some irregularities. They go back at least 3 years, possibly longer. He looked at her notes, then at her. How much, he said. What I've found so far suggests approximately $300, but I think there's more. Something moved through his face, not quite anger, something quieter and colder. Harrison kept those books. He appears to have kept them for his own benefit, Nora said, as well as yours. He looked back at the notes. How long to find all of it? A week, perhaps 2. He nodded once. Do He took his plate to the window and stood there eating, looking out at the darkness and the first points of stars, and said nothing else. She had been at Sentinel Ridge for 9 days when she found the other thing. She had been organizing the most recent year of documents when she found a folder she had assumed was correspondence. It was bound with twine tied more carefully than the others. When she opened it, she found not letters, but legal documents. The language was formal and dense, the kind of prose designed to obscure rather than communicate. But Nora had spent 6 years reading contracts, and she had learned to find the operative sentences the way you found a dropped needle in a workroom floor, by moving slowly and keeping your eyes close to the ground. She read for 40 minutes. The documents were from a law firm in Cheyenne representing something called the Continental Land and Improvement Company. The most recent was dated 3 weeks ago. It referenced a land survey from 1880, a competing claim to the water rights on the southern pasture, and an unresolved question about the original homestead claim filed by Cade's father in 1869. There was a name on every document, Aldous Pike Esquire. The conclusion was clear enough. The Continental Land and Improvement Company believed it had a superior claim to approximately 400 acres of Sentinel Ridge's best grazing land and all water rights attached to it. Nora looked at the documents for a long time. She thought about Cade Morrow standing at the window eating his supper, looking out at his land in the dark. She thought about the particular practicality of a man who needed a working household and who also needed it now seemed clear a co-signatory on revised deed documentation. A wife could sign. A wife would complicate Pike's claim, slow the proceedings, buy time. A wife with a working knowledge of records and accounts would be especially useful. She closed the folder and tied it back the way she had found it. She sat with her hands flat on the desk for a long time, feeling the cold, specific weight of a thing you've seen that you cannot unsee. He might have told her. He might still. Or the arrangement might be exactly what he had said, in the land dispute something he intended to handle separately, and she was reading motive into coincidence. She had been wrong about motives before. She had, for 3 years, believed that Thomas Reed loved her for herself, and not for the steady management she provided of a life he found too complicated. She had been wrong. He had chosen Violet the moment Violet had smiled at him across a parlor table. Violet, who was luminous and easy, and demanded nothing structural. "You're so strong, Nora. You'll manage." She picked up her pen and went back to the ledger. She did not mention the folder that evening, or the next. But she watched Cade more carefully after that. She watched the way he moved through papers at his desk on evenings when she was in the study, the particular set of his jaw when he looked at certain documents, the way he sometimes sat with a single sheet for a long time before putting it back in the drawer. She watched the way he answered the door when a rider came up from the road. On the third week, a man in a town coat with a leather satchel and boots too clean for someone who'd ridden out from Rawlins rather than being driven. She was in the kitchen doorway when Cade spoke to him on the porch. She did not try to overhear. She did not need to. The posture of the conversation told her everything. Cade standing with his arms at his sides, holding himself together by decision rather than ease, and the visitor leaning forward the way men lean when they believe they have the advantage. When the visitor left, Cade came back inside and stood in the hallway. "That was Pike," he said, not an explanation, more like a stone placed on a table. "I see," Nora said. "He'll be back. He comes every few weeks." He paused. "You've been through most of the records." "Most of the financial records, yes." A longer pause. The lamplight moved in the draft from the closing door. "There's a folder," he said. "Legal matters. I'd appreciate it if you left that one alone." Nora looked at him steadily. "I've already read it." The silence that followed was different from the silences she had grown used to. Not the silence of a man who doesn't speak easily, but the silence of a man who has been caught in something. "How much do you understand of it?" he asked. His voice was careful. "Enough. The water rights claim is the crux. If Pike can establish the 1880 survey as the operative boundary, he can separate the south pasture from the main water source. The ranch becomes unviable in a dry year." She paused. "The original homestead claim from 1869 should establish prior rights. But you'd need the full documentation, and it would need to be argued before a county judge." Cade stared at her. "You're a bookkeeper," he said, not accusing more as if he were revising a map. "I kept accounts for a dry goods concern for 6 years. The owner had a habit of being swindled by suppliers, so I learned to read contracts." She let that settle. "Mr. Morrow, why did you want a wife?" He was very still. "Not a housekeeper," she said. "You could have hired a housekeeper. You wrote for a wife. Why?" The wind came up outside, running through the pines. "A married man filing a revised deed correction can do so jointly with his wife," he said finally. "It complicates Pike's claim, makes the documentation harder to challenge on grounds of sole ownership when the original claim was filed by my father and I inherited it after his remarriage. So a co-signatory on the deed would buy time. And time is what I need to find the original survey markers and file the counterclaim. He looked at the window. I intended to explain it after. When I knew if it would, after you knew if I was useful enough to be worth telling the truth to. He didn't answer, which was she supposed an answer. She stood there in the hallway with the lamplight and the wind outside and the months of her life that had brought her to this particular moment. There it is, she thought. The real architecture. Not cruelty, she didn't think it was cruelty. Just the same cold practicality she herself used, applied to a situation where need had outpaced honesty. She recognized it. She had done it herself in smaller ways more times than she could count. That recognition did not make it comfortable, but it made it legible. I'll continue with the financial records, she said. When I finish those, tell me what you need from the legal documentation. She went back into the study and closed the door. And behind the closed door, alone with the lamplight and the ledgers in the wind, finding the gap at the windowsill, Nora Calloway sat with both hands flat on the desk and breathed. She was not what she had come here to be. She was not passing through. She was in some way she had not yet decided how to name exactly where the current of events had been carrying her since Violet had handed her those letters in the parlor in Cincinnati. She was also angry, a clean, specific anger, not the hot kind, but the kind that runs cold and deep and is useful. She picked up her pen. The numbers on the page resolved themselves into clarity one after another like stars emerging after the last of the light. End of part 1, continue in part 2. The days that followed had a rhythm to them. And Nora, who had spent her life constructing rhythms in other people's chaos, found herself settling into this one with an ease that surprised her. She rose at 5 before the household stirred. She had always been an early waker. Sleep had never held her long, as though, even in rest, some part of her was keeping watch. She built the kitchen fire herself on the mornings when Ruth was slow to rise, and she had the coffee started and the first pan of biscuits in the oven by the time Ruth appeared in the doorway with her braids still half undone and something that was not quite a smile but was adjacently warm on her face. "You don't have to do that," Ruth said the first morning Nora had beaten her to the kitchen. "I was awake," Nora said. Ruth tied off her braid and took down the skillet for eggs. "He doesn't notice what you do." "I'm not doing it for him to notice." Ruth had looked at her sideways, at that, a slow horizontal appraisal that felt like it was measuring something Nora couldn't see. Kate ate his breakfast at 5:30 with the focused efficiency of a man consuming fuel. He said little. He was already thinking about the first hour of work, his eyes somewhere on the far side of the walls in the south pasture, on the drainage line that had been failing since the spring thaw, on whatever the season was pressing toward. He drank his coffee, standing and left, while Nora was still on her first cup. She noticed after the first week that he always paused at the kitchen doorway on his way out. He did not look back, but he paused a half-second hesitation, like a man remembering something he had meant to say, then deciding against it. She filed it away the way she filed everything. The financial irregularities were worse than she had initially estimated. Harrison, the previous manager, apparently dismissed some 8 months ago, under circumstances Kate had not elaborated on, had been methodical in his small thefts. The discrepancies were never large enough to be immediately obvious, but they were consistent and they compounded. Over the 5 years Nora was able to trace clearly, the total came to over $900. She laid it out on a single sheet of paper and brought it to Kate on a Thursday evening after supper. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. $930, he said. Thereabouts. I may find more in the older records. Harrison is in Cheyenne. His voice was flat. I knew the numbers were wrong. I didn't know how wrong. You couldn't have known without the time to go through it properly. He looked up from the paper. You're making excuses for me. I'm explaining why accounting is a skilled profession, she said, and not a hobby. For a moment, something moved across his face, quick as a hawk's shadow across dry ground. She almost thought it was the beginning of a smile. It was gone before she could be certain. He folded the summary and put it in his shirt pocket. Thank you, he said. 2 words. Spare and direct. But the way he said them, the particular texture of someone not entirely comfortable with gratitude, but making the effort anyway, told her more than a longer speech would have. She nodded and went back to the study. 3 weeks in, Ruth asked her to ride out to the far north pasture to check whether the water trough there was still frozen. I can walk, Nora said. It's 4 miles. Ruth handed her a canvas bag with canteens and crackers. Cade said the bay mare is quiet. You've ridden before. Nora had ridden perhaps 6 times in her life. After a fashion, she said. The bay mare was a solid, patient animal who appeared to have a philosophical acceptance of whatever the day required. Nora had gotten herself into the saddle and was pointing the mare toward the gate when Cade appeared at the barn door. He looked at her hands on the reins. "Hold them lower," he said. He came alongside and without preamble reached up and adjusted her grip, moving her left hand down and slightly forward, shifting the angle of contact with the bit. His fingers were brief and impersonal, but the warmth of them registered on her cold hands like a separate weather system entirely. "Weight in your heels," he said, "not your toes. When she moves, stay loose in the hip, don't brace. I know how to ride." "You know how you think you know," he said. "That's a different thing." He stepped back. She rode out through the gate and did not look back to see if he was watching. She thought about loose hips for the first mile, which was probably not the instruction he had intended to linger. The water trough was frozen solid. She noted it checked the fence line, found 2 posts that would need attention come spring. She wrote the post numbers in her small notebook and turned the mare toward home. The ride back was easier. She found herself settling into the saddle the way he had described without having to think about it. The sway and correction, the conversation between her seat and the horse's movement. The land was very quiet at that particular time of afternoon, the light beginning to lengthen and warm the ridge lines sharpening against the sky going violet at the edges. She realized she had not thought about Cincinnati in 3 days. The realization sat uneasily for a moment, then settled. That evening, she found Ruth sitting at the kitchen table long after supper was cleared, a small piece of beadwork in her hands. The firelight caught the glass beads and threw small points of color against the wall. Nora sat down across from her with her own mending 2 work shirts that needed the elbows patched. She threaded her needle and began. They worked in silence for a while. The fire settled. Outside, the coyotes started their evening conversation somewhere above the east ridge. "You've been here a long time," Nora said eventually. "Since before he took over," Ruth said. "Since his wife." Nora's needle moved steadily. "Ellen." "Ellen." Ruth's hands paused briefly on the beadwork. "She was a good woman. Came from Pennsylvania with courage and strong hands and more determination than she knew what to do with. And she didn't survive the winters." Ruth looked at her. The look was slow and deliberate and slightly off what Nora had expected. "The winters she survived," Ruth said. "Ellen was not soft. She was not afraid of cold or hard work or silence." She looked back at her beating. What she could not survive was being the only one carrying something that should have been carried by 2. Nora kept her needle moving. "He wouldn't let her in," Ruth said. "Not all the way. He thought he was protecting her from the weight of it, the land dispute, even then the money worries, the loneliness of a ranch at the edge of the world. He kept it inside and gave her only the surface of things. And she was too proud to say, 'I can see you're drowning. Let me hold some of it.'" Ruth's voice was matter-of-fact, the way people speak about true things they have thought about a long time. She went out in November of the year before the baby came trying to find something, documents, something she had gotten wind of about the land, and she got caught in the weather. By the time they found her, she had the cough. The baby came early. Neither of them, she stopped. The fire crackled. "He blames himself," Nora said. "He blames himself for the wrong things," Ruth said. "He thinks he failed to protect her. He did not fail to protect her. He failed to trust her. There is a difference." Nora set down her mending and looked at the woman across the table. "Why are you telling me this?" Ruth's dark eyes were direct and untroubled. "Because you are the kind of person who will try to protect yourself by keeping a careful distance," she said. "And he is the kind of person who will let you, because that is what he is used to. And if you both keep your careful distances, you will be very useful to each other for a very long time, and that will be all." Nora picked her mending back up. She thought about the $900 summary in Cade's shirt pocket. She thought about the folder of legal documents. She thought about the way he had adjusted her grip on the reins, brief and impersonal and warm. "I'm not looking for anything more than what we agreed to," she said. "I know," Ruth said. "That's what I'm telling you." Outside, the coyotes had stopped, and the night was very still, and the stars over the eastern ridge were thick and cold and bright, the way they get at altitude when the air is clean, as though they are trying to say something in a language just beyond the edge of understanding. The letter from Thomas arrived on a Wednesday. Nora recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she had fully taken it from Ruth's hand, that same handwriting she had filed away 3 years ago in the cabinet of her memory labeled closed. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, envelope in hand, and felt something move through her that was not grief but was in the same neighborhood, the particular ache of a door you have stopped expecting to open, swinging on its hinge unexpectedly. She took it to the East Room and sat on the bed and opened it. Dear Nora, it began, and the familiar cadence of it was its own small cruelty. She read it once quickly, the way you read something you already know the shape of. He had heard about Violet's engagement. Edmund had worked alongside him for a time, and the gossip had traveled. He wrote that he was glad for Violet's happiness. He wrote that he thought of Nora sometimes, of her steadiness and her good sense qualities he had perhaps not sufficiently appreciated. He wrote that he found himself in Cincinnati with somewhat more frequency than before on business, and that if she found herself back at her mother's house, he hoped it might be agreeable to. She stopped reading. She held the letter for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Not the weight of paper, but the weight of 3 years, and all the evenings she had sat at the parlor window, waiting for a knock that did not come. The particular weight of having understood eventually that the knock would not come because she was too quiet and too useful and too reliably there, and men like Thomas did not knock on doors they believed would always be open. She got up and carried the letter to the kitchen. She fed it to the stove. She stood watching it until it was entirely ash, the flames eating the careful handwriting, the carefully chosen words, the careful implication that perhaps now, without the more luminous option, she might be willing to serve as a reasonable substitute. You're so strong, Nora. You'll manage. The fire ate the last corner, and she closed the stove door and went back to the study. The ledger was where she had left it. The numbers were what they always were, honest, precise, indifferent to anything except what was true. She sat down and found her place and picked up the pen, and the clean scratch of it against the paper was in its way the most comforting sound she knew. She was still working 2 hours later when she heard Cade's step in the hallway, heavier than usual, the particular tread of a man who is tired in a way that goes beyond the body. He stopped in the doorway of the study. She looked up. He looked at her, the desk covered in organized papers, the neat columns of her handwriting, the lamp adjusted to the best angle for close work. He looked at her in the way she had stopped expecting people to look at her, which was like she was the thing itself and not a useful extension of it. Late, he said. I wanted to finish the 1878 cattle tallies. He nodded. He did not leave. He leaned against the door frame the way she had seen him lean against walls and posts and fences, not idly, but the way a man leans when he is deciding something and needs a moment for the decision to settle. There was a letter for you today, he said. Ruth mentioned it. There was. Nora looked back at the ledger. I've dealt with it. A pause. Good news from home. Not particularly. She turned a page. Old business. Finished now. She felt his eyes on her for a moment more. Then he pushed himself upright and said quietly, Don't work past the oil, and went up the hallway, and the house went still around her. Nora sat with her hand resting on the open page and listened to the ranch settle into night, the distant stamp of a horse in the barn, the last of the wind in the pines, the tick of the cooling stove. She was not what she had come here to be. She was not entirely certain yet what she was. But she was here in this room, in this light, with this work, and the cold arithmetic of her situation had somewhere in the past weeks stopped feeling like a trap. She turned back to the numbers. They kept their patient honesty long after the lamp began to dim. The morning Cade Morrow finally spoke about Ellen, it was not because he had decided to. It was because the weather made silence impossible. A storm had come down from the north 2 days earlier. Not the catastrophic kind, just the grinding, low-sky misery of a late-season cold front, gray and wet, the kind that gets into the bones of the ranch and requires everyone to stay closer to the house than usual. The seasonal hands ate in the bunkhouse. May's stable work was done by the hour rather than by the day. And Cade, whose usual remedy for whatever ailed him was to be on a horse and moving, was contained. He was in the study when Nora came in to continue with the older records. He had the land folder open on the desk and was reading something with the focused grimness of a man looking at a bill he cannot pay. He didn't look up when she entered. She went to her corner of the desk and began with the 1877 records, and for a time there was only the sound of rain on the roof and turning pages. She found something he said. Nora looked up. He was still looking at the folder, but his jaw had a different set, less the tightness of concentration and more the tightness of old damage being pressed on. Ellen, he said, before she died, she was going through old correspondence looking for the original boundary survey. She'd gotten a letter from a neighbor, Hartwell's South Quarter, saying he'd seen someone from Pike's firm out near the creek markers. And she went to look. She didn't tell me. He closed the folder. Not hard very carefully the way you close something you don't trust yourself to close quickly. She knew I had enough to manage. She thought she could just go and look and come back and tell me what she found. But the weather turned. November in the high country, he said. It was not an explanation, it was a verdict. Nora did not speak. She had learned over the past weeks that Cade's silences were not always invitations to fill. Sometimes they were the conversation, the important part, happening in the space between words. I found out afterward, he said, she'd been watching Pike's movements for nearly a year. Hartwell told me after. She never said a word. He looked at the window. The rain ran down the glass in small rivers. I thought she was unhappy here. The isolation. That's what I told myself. That I'd brought a woman out to the edge of everything, and she'd withered. He stopped. But she hadn't, Nora said. No, she'd been fighting for the place. He looked at his hands. And I didn't know, because she didn't tell me, He stopped again. He did not finish the sentence. But Nora heard what was in the space where the ending should have been, because I had made it clear somehow that the burdens were mine to carry alone, and the protection was mine to provide, and she was not to trouble herself with the weight of what kept us here. It wasn't her fault, Nora said carefully. No. His voice was flat and very quiet. It was mine. I was so busy making sure she didn't have to worry that I never let her help, and help was what she was built for. The rain moved on the glass. She sounds, Nora said after a moment, like a woman who would have been very useful in the study. There was a pause. She was, he said, and there was something in those two words, a warmth quiet and grieved and genuine, that told Nora more about the marriage than anything else she might have asked. She looked back at her ledger. They worked in silence for the rest of the afternoon, and it was a different silence than before. Not the silence of two people keeping careful distances, but the silence of two people who have, without ceremony, moved one room closer to each other. The thaw came in the second week of the third month. Not spring, nothing so final as that, but the first loosening of the cold, the days running 2 or 3 degrees warmer, the south-facing slopes showing brown where the snow had retreated. With the thaw came more of Pike's men. Not Pike himself, not yet, but riders who appeared on the boundaries methodical and unhurried, with surveying equipment and the patient air of people doing work they have already been paid for. Cade watched them from the ridge above the south pasture one afternoon, and Nora, who had ridden out with him on Ruth's instructions to check the fence line, watched him watching them. His face was completely still. How long, she asked. Since last fall, he said. They're remapping the creek boundary. If they can establish the high water mark from the 1880 flood year as the operative line instead of the 1869 survey, they can argue that the water rights belong to the section east of the creek, which is the section they're claiming. And the cattle on the south pasture need that water. Without it, the south pasture is grazing that we can't use past July in a dry year. 3 years in 5, we lose a third of the herd or move them north at a cost we can't sustain. He paused. It would take 5 years, maybe 7, but the ranch dies. Nora looked at the riders below. They were moving with the slow confidence of people who have a plan that is already in motion and only needs time. The original homestead documentation, she said. The 1869 survey markers. You said you hadn't found them in the boxes. Not yet. But they exist. My father filed the original claim. He was thorough. If he filed it, the documentation exists somewhere. I've looked through most of what's in the house. Most, Nora said. He looked at her. There are crates in the storage room at the back of the barn, she said. I saw them when I was looking for the ledger boxes. They look older than the ones in the study. His expression shifted. I thought those were equipment records. Some of them may be, she said, but the crates at the back left wall have a different kind of dust on them. Older, and the wood is a different color stored in the dry longer. He stared at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Then he turned his horse back toward the ranch without another word, and she followed. They found the crates that afternoon. There were 4 of them stacked in the back corner of the barn's dry storage under a canvas tarp that had accumulated 15 years of dust and the occasional suggestion of old mouse activity. The wood was pale with age, the rope handles stiff. Cade pulled the first crate down with the kind of careful force you use when you don't know yet if what you're handling is fragile. Inside folders, bound with cord that had gone brittle, paper yellow at the edges, but intact, the dry cold of a Wyoming barn being, as it happened, excellent preservation. Nora took off her coat, hung it on the nearest post, rolled up her sleeves, and began. It took 3 days. 3 days of sitting on the barn floor and the storage room floor, and eventually on a stool she had brought from the kitchen, working through documents that ranged from cattle pedigrees to water agreements to personal correspondence between Cade's father and men who were 30 years dead. She sorted as she went, building piles on the tarp, labeling each one in her careful handwriting on small slips of paper weighted with stones. Cade worked alongside her for the first day, then was called away by the demands of the ranch, a fence section that had come down overnight, the seasonal hands arriving for their first week of spring work, and she continued alone. The ranch went on around her. She could hear it, the calls of the hands, the sound of horses being worked in the near paddock, the regular percussion of the barn itself. Ruth brought her lunch on a tin plate and set it on an upturned crate without comment. On the afternoon of the second day, Nora found the survey folder. It was in the third crate between a copy of the original homestead filing and a hand-drawn map of the ranch's boundaries as they had existed in 1869. The survey itself was there, the original markers documented with the particularity of a man who had staked his future on this ground and intended to be precise about it. The creek boundary was clearly established, the water rights clearly attached to the Morrow claim, the signatures of both the county surveyor and the territorial registrar at the bottom in faded ink. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. This was the document that could end Pike's claim. This was what Ellen had gone out in the cold looking for. And there was something else. Tucked inside the survey folder in the pocket formed by the folded cover page in a place where it would only be found by someone looking carefully was a single sheet of paper in a handwriting Nora did not recognize. Neat, precise, a woman's hand. It was a list, dates, names, amounts, notes beside each entry in the same precise handwriting, surveyor's fee paid to Pike Firm 2 weeks before official survey filed, county registrar, see deed book 7, page 43. Hartwell reports a marker moved witness J. Birch. At the bottom of the list, a single underlined line. If this is found, the survey of 1880 was paid for and directed by the Continental Land Company before it was filed as independent. The original 1869 markers still stand. Don't let them have it. It was not signed. It did not need to be. Nora read it twice. Then she sat in the dusty storage room of the Sentinel Ridge barn in the particular stillness of a woman who has just understood something large and quiet and irreversible, and she felt the weight of 3 years of careful distance begin almost without her permission to shift. Ellen Morrow had known. Ellen had done this work, the slow, quiet, detail-oriented work of building a case alone in secret, tucking her evidence where it would survive, trusting that someone capable would eventually find it. She had trusted the work. Nora picked up the list and the survey folder and walked toward the house. She found Kate at this fence line behind the barn repairing a section the spring ground movement had loosened. He was working alone the way he worked most things, and he had his back to her when she came around the corner. But something in the quality of her footsteps, she would wonder about this later, that he seemed to hear her specifically amid all the sounds of the working ranch, made him turn before she called out. He looked at her hands. He looked at what she was carrying. He came over the fence in one movement and crossed the ground between them faster than she had seen him move before. And when he stopped in front of her, his breath had gone slightly uneven, not from the effort of running, but from something else. She handed him the survey folder. He opened it. He read it, the original survey, the markers, the signatures. His hands were very still. Then she gave him Ellen's list. She watched his face. She had expected she had been braced for the shuttered blankness. He usually showed the particular absence of expression that was his default in moments of wait. What she saw instead was different. It moved too fast for her to name each thing that passed through it, but she caught recognition, and then something that was not grief exactly, but lived in the same country, and then slowly like a light finding its way through narrow gaps, understanding. He read the list all the way through. He read it again. When he looked up, his eyes were clear and very dark, and there was something in them she had not seen before, a kind of openness, the look of a man who has been living behind a wall so long that he has stopped knowing it is there, that seeing it for the first time from the outside. She found it, he said. His voice was rough. She built the case, Nora said. She just ran out of time to use it. He stood very still with the papers in his hands. The wind came down from the north ridge, cold and clean. Nora did not look away. She watched him understand what his wife had done. She watched him understand what his own silence had cost, not with the guilt that would make him smaller, but with the particular sorrow of a man who finally sees the whole shape of something he had only ever seen in pieces. She did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. After a long time, he folded the papers carefully and put them inside his coat. The 1880 survey markers are on record with the county, he said. His voice had settled back into itself, but different, lower, and more deliberate. If we bring the original 1869 documentation and Ellen's notes to the county judge and file a formal objection to Pike's current proceedings, you'll need to do it before his next filing date, Nora said. The documents he served 3 weeks ago give you 30 days. That's 12 days from now. He looked at her. I've been tracking it, she said, in case it became relevant. Another one of those long silences. A different kind. I owe you an honest accounting, he said then. All of it. What I told you about why I wanted a wife, the deed co-signature, that's true. But it's not the whole truth. He looked at the ridge. The whole truth is that I have been running this ranch like a man running from something for 3 years, and I was starting to notice what I was running from. He paused. I thought if there was someone here, someone capable, and I thought it might slow me down enough to look. And have you, Nora said. Looked. The wind moved between them. I'm looking now, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, steady, unhurried the way she did the work she trusted. Then she looked down at her hands, the scar on her right knuckle, the ink stain at the base of her index finger. Hands that had done the work without asking whether the work would be acknowledged for so long that they had forgotten acknowledgement was a thing that could happen. 12 days, she said. We should start tonight. He nodded, and they walked back toward the house together, the wind carrying the last of the cold behind them and the first suggestion of warmth ahead. The nights that followed were long and close with work. Cade cleared the dining table completely, and they spread the documentation across it. The original survey, Ellen's notes, the legal filings from Pike's firm, the county records Cade rode into Rawlins to obtain on the second day. They worked by lamplight after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Ruth had taken herself to bed with the quiet dignity of a woman who has seen enough to know when she is not needed. They did not talk a great deal. They built the case the way Nora built accounts methodically, each piece verified, each connection documented, the logical structure tested from multiple directions before being recorded. Cade knew the land and its history in his bones. Nora knew how documents told stories where the gaps were, how to make the argument legible to a judge who would not know the geography. They were good at this together, better than either of them would have been alone. She noticed this. She thought he noticed it too. On the third night, working past midnight, she made a copying error on a summary document and caught it only when she had already moved on to the next line. She put her pen down and pressed her fingers against her eyes and sighed a small sound, nothing dramatic, the simple exhalation of a tired woman. Cade looked up from the boundary map he had been annotating. He got up, went to the kitchen, and came back with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of the cold biscuits Ruth had left covered on the counter. He set 1 cup near Nora's hand without comment and sat back down. She looked at the cup for a moment. Thank you, she said. He had already looked back at the map. Don't work past the oil, he said, and she almost told him that the lamp had another hour at least. And then she thought about the shape of the words, the particular careful way he had of expressing concern without calling it concern, and she said nothing. She picked up the coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth in. Outside, the night was very clear. The kind of clear that comes before weather changes every star, absolutely itself, the mountains a dark weight against the dark sky, the wind entirely still for once, as though the land was holding its breath. Nora looked at the document spread across the table. She looked at the hand that rested at the edge of the boundary map, his hand broad and scarred, the knuckles slightly rough from the fence work, perfectly still as he read. She looked at her own hand beside it, not touching the inch of table between them. She thought about Ruth's words. You will be very useful to each other for a very long time, and that will be all. She thought about Ellen's list tucked carefully where someone capable would find it. She thought about her own hands doing the work that needed doing, not asking for acknowledgement for so long that she had stopped expecting it. She picked up her pen. There were 10 days left before the filing deadline. She turned back to the work, and the lamp burned steadily, and the night kept its enormous silence. And something in the room, something that had no name yet but was undeniably present, moved 1 more careful inch forward. On the 6th day, Pike came himself. He arrived mid-morning in a good buggy with a hired driver dressed for town in a way that was designed, Nora thought, to make the ranch feel rough by comparison. He was perhaps 50, with a face that had learned long ago how to be friendly without giving anything away. He shook Cade's hand on the porch with the warmth of a man who believes he has already won. Nora was in the kitchen doorway. Pike's eyes found her immediately at the practiced sweep of a man assessing a room, and he smiled. "Mrs. Morrow," he said. "Miss Calloway," Nora said. "I manage the ranch accounts." Something shifted in the smile, a small recalibration. "Ah, I hadn't realized Morrow had brought in additional assistance." "The accounts needed assistance," she said pleasantly. 12 years of records and several interesting irregularities. You know how it is with paperwork. The longer it goes unreviewed, the more surprises you find. She held his gaze while she said it. She was smiling, but her eyes were doing something different. Pike's gaze moved back to Cade. "Well, I've come to discuss the survey question. I think there are terms that could satisfy both parties here, a partial adjustment of the boundary that would—" "We're not interested in a partial adjustment," Cade said. "We have the original 1869 survey documentation, and we're filing a formal counterclaim at the county courthouse." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a calculated move encounters an unexpected obstacle. Pike looked at Cade. He looked at Nora. He looked at Cade again. "I see," he said, in a different voice entirely. The friendliness was still there, but underneath it, something had gone flat and watchful. "You've been doing your homework." "The records have been reviewed, yes," Nora said, "thoroughly." He left shortly after, and as his buggy rolled back down the ranch road, Cade stood on the porch and watched it until it disappeared around the first bend. He said nothing. Nora stood beside him. "He'll move faster now," she said. "I know. We should ride to Rollins day after tomorrow. File before he can arrange a counter-argument." "I know." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You handled him well." She thought about Pike's eyes finding her in the kitchen doorway, about the smile that thought it was in control. "I've handled men like him before," she said. "Different industry, same technique." He looked at her sideways, and there it was again, that thing that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same country. They went back inside. That night, long after the house had gone to sleep, Nora sat alone at the dining room table with Ellen's list in front of her. She was not reading it. She had read it so many times she could have written it from memory. She was sitting with it the way you sit with something that has changed the shape of your understanding. Ellen Morrow had been practical and strong and careful. She had seen the threat clearly done, the work methodically, left the evidence where it could be found. She had done it quietly without asking anyone to notice. She had done it the way Nora had always done everything, and it had not saved her. But the work had outlasted her. The work was here on this table doing now what she had built it to do. Nora thought about that for a long time. She thought about the difference between doing the work because no one else would, and doing the work because you had chosen it. She thought about the difference between being useful and belonging. She thought about the East Room at the end of the hallway, which had begun to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like a room that was learning the shape of her. She folded Ellen's list carefully and put it back in the survey folder. She went to the window and looked out at the ranch in the late moonlight, the dark shape of the barn, the pale ridgeline above it, the long South Valley breathing under the stars. She was still here. She had arrived planning to leave. She had stayed because she had to. And somewhere in the weeks between that arrival and this moment, without her noticing the exact crossing, she had stopped staying because she had to and started staying for a different reason. She was not entirely sure yet what to do with that. But she knew the shape of it, the way you know the shape of a thing you are holding in the dark, not by seeing it, but by the weight of it in your hands. She turned from the window and went to bed. Outside, the stars held their cold positions over the Sentinel Ridge, and the land kept its quiet, and somewhere below in the south pasture, the cattle made their small sounds in the dark, the sound of living things trusting that the ground beneath them would hold. End of part 2. Continue in part 3, the south pasture. The day before they were to ride to Rollins, the south fence came down. Not a section, the whole model run, a quarter-mile of wire and posts that had been standing since Cade's father set them in 1874. It came down in the night, and in the morning 24 cattle from the neighboring section were mixed in with the Sentinel Ridge herd, and the 2 ranch hands who found it rode back to the house with faces that said, the damage went beyond what a long day could fix. Cade did not swear. He looked at the report, looked at the sky, clear cold, the kind of day that would at least cooperate, and turned to Nora. "If I ride out to start the repair, I can't be in Rollins tomorrow," he said. "The courthouse filing closes at 4. If we miss the window—" "I can go," Nora said. The hands looked at each other. Cade looked at her. "I have all the documentation in order," she said. "I've read the filing requirements twice. I know exactly what needs to be submitted and in what order." She paused. "Unless you believe I'll be turned away at the counter." You might be, he said, not unkindly. A woman filing a land counter claim alone without the landowner present. I'll be filing as your authorized representative, she said. Write me a letter to that effect and sign it, and the documentation will be accepted. I'll get Ruth to witness it. He was very still. Nora, he said, the use of her name the first time she realized that he had used it without a preceding formality stopped her. She looked at him. You don't have to, he started. I know, she said. That stopped him. I know I don't have to, she said. The month is long over. You said yourself the return fare is yours to pay whenever I ask. She looked at him steadily. I'm not doing this because I have to. I'm doing it because the filing needs to happen, and I'm the one who can do it, and you need to fix that fence. He looked at her for a long moment, the way he had looked at her on the platform in Rawlins, that complete unhurried attention, except that this time there was something else in it, something that had not been there on the platform. I'll write the letter, he said. The ride to Rawlins took 6 hours, Nora on the bay mare and one of the younger hands, Tom, riding alongside as escort. Tom was 19 and talkative in the way of young men who have been working in silence and welcomed the excuse for speech, and Nora let him talk, which seemed to be what he most needed. She arrived at the Carbon County Courthouse at 2:30 in the afternoon. The clerk at the land filing counter was a man of middle years with the particular expression of someone who has been doing the same job for long enough that surprises no longer interest him. He looked at Nora's documentation, at Cade's letter, at the original survey folder, at Ellen's notes presented as supporting evidence, and then back at Nora. The original survey is from 1869, he said. He was not asking. Yes, filed by James Morrow on the occasion of the original homestead claim. The markers are documented here. She opened the folder to the specific page, and the water rights are attached to the western boundary as established by the Creek Survey, dated May 14, 1869. She pointed to the registrar's signature. He looked at it. He looked at the Continental land counter filing date, which was on record with the county. He looked at the date on the 1880 survey Pike's firm had filed. The 1880 survey was conducted after the original claim was established, Nora said quietly, and we have documentation suggesting the survey was commissioned by the claimant, not conducted independently. She placed Ellen's notes on the counter, open to the relevant entry. The clerk read it. He turned back to the original survey. He was quiet for a moment, doing the kind of reading that is not just reading, but weighing. I'll need to register this with the county judge, he said finally. Yes, Nora said. That's what we're asking for. A formal review before the Continental Land Company's filing is ruled on. He looked at her. The judge will schedule a hearing, he said. Both parties present, documentation reviewed. Yes, that's exactly what we want. He stamped the counterfiling form with the particular solid authority of a stamp that means something, signed it, and handed her the receipt. Nora folded it, placed it carefully inside her coat, thanked the clerk with a formality that matched his own, and walked out of the Carbon County Courthouse into the afternoon sun. Tom was waiting with the horses. Done, he said. Done, she said. She mounted the bay mare, and Tom turned his horse south toward the Sentinel Ridge Road, and Nora followed, and the afternoon light lay long and gold across the plain, and the far mountains were perfectly clear. Every ridge and shadow defined the whole enormous country, visible and still. She was 6 hours from the ranch. She thought about what she was riding toward, and the thought had a different quality than it had 4 weeks ago, when she had ridden this road for the first time in the other direction, looking at this same country with the eyes of someone being carried away from a life toward the uncertain. She was not uncertain now. She was not sure of everything. There were things between herself and Cade Morrow that were unresolved and would need the speaking of words she had not yet found. But she was sure of this ground. She was sure of the work. She was sure of the particular shape of a life that asked everything of you and gave back what you earned. The mare moved steadily beneath her. The sun was going down behind the mountains when she came up the ranch road and saw the lights of the house. Cade was in the kitchen when she came in, washed, and sitting at the table with the tiredness of a man who has spent 12 hours in physical labor and is only now stopping. Ruth set a plate in front of him and then turned to look at Nora in the doorway. Cade looked up. Nora took the receipt from inside her coat and laid it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He read it. He looked at her. The judge will schedule a hearing, she said. We'll need to be present with the documentation. But the counter-filing is registered. Pike can't move until the review is complete. The kitchen was very quiet. How long? He said. His voice had gone slightly rough. 6 to 8 weeks, the clerk said. Long enough to get the spring work done. He looked at the receipt again. He looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at her, and this time there was no careful blankness, no assessor's distance. Just a man looking at a woman who had ridden 12 hours to do a thing that needed doing and understanding in a way that went past words what that meant. Nora, he said. She waited. He did not say anything else. But he pulled out the chair beside him, the one that faced the window, the one that had been empty since the first evening she had sat at this table, and he looked at it and then at her. She sat down. Ruth set a plate in front of her without comment and went back to the stove. They ate together in the particular silence of two people who have, without declaring it, chosen something. The lamp was steady. The fire was low and red. Outside, the spring wind was beginning in the pines, that first green-smelling wind that means the cold is not permanent after all. They did not speak. There would be time for speaking. Tonight, there was just this two scarred and careful people at a kitchen table at the edge of the world, in the quiet, ordinary miracle of a meal shared without strategy. The hearing was scheduled for the 14th of May. 6 weeks of spring work lay between that date and the evening Nora had ridden back from Rawlins with the counterfiling receipt inside her coat. 6 weeks that had the particular quality of time that both accumulates and disappears each day, full and separate, the days together becoming something larger that she could only see when she stopped and looked back at how far they had come. The ranch was different in spring. Not softer, exactly. The work was as relentless as it had been in winter. Perhaps more so because the warming brought everything at once: calving fence, repair the first cutting of the high meadow hay, the creek running full and fast with snowmelt that tested every bridge and crossing. The day started before dawn and ended after it, and in between, there was always more than the hours allowed. Nora worked all of it. She had found somewhere in the weeks of daily labor that she had stopped measuring herself by the terms she had arrived with. She had stopped thinking, I am an employee here. This is not my home. I do not belong to this place. Not because she had made a decision, but because the doing of the work had a way of making those calculations irrelevant. You could not ride out in a cold dawn to check the water line on the north pasture thinking about whether this was your water line to check and simultaneously check the water line properly. The work required all of you. And when you gave all of you to the work gave back its own particular claim. She understood now in her body the way you can't understand from thinking what Cade had meant when he had said it asks everything of you and gives back what you earn. The calving came in the 3rd week of the 6th, and it came hard. 3 cows had gone overdue, the coldest spring in 8 years, keeping the timing uneven. And when the first of them started in labor on a Thursday night with the temperature dropping again, and the wind coming off the north ridge with a bite that remembered January, Cade went to the barn and did not come back. At 2 in the morning, Nora got up. She dressed in the work clothes she had acquired over the weeks, her city wardrobe, having been quietly set aside in the cedar trunk in favor of the heavier, more honest clothing of the ranch, and went to the barn. The barn was warm and loud with animal breath and the particular sounds of a creature in labor. Cade was in the stall, crouched beside the cow, his hands already doing what needed doing. He looked up when she came in, not with surprise, but with the expression of a man who has learned to accept help when it comes. Hold the lamp, he said. She held the lamp. What followed was 2 hours of focused, unbeautiful work. Kind of work that does not permit distance or reservation, that requires you to be entirely present because the thing in front of you demands it. She held the lamp and handed instruments when he asked, and kept her voice steady when the cow struggled and Cade's jaw went tight with the effort of managing a situation that was several degrees past difficult. The calf came at 4 in the morning, small, wet, furious at existence. It shook its head and tried to stand and fell, and tried again, and beside it the cow turned with an attention so complete it seemed impossible that an animal could contain that much urgency. Nora set the lamp down on the stall rail and stood back and watched the cow clean her calf with the single-minded devotion of new motherhood. Cade sat back on his heels, rolled his shoulders, let out a long, slow breath. 2 more, he said. I'll stay, Nora said. He looked at her. Her coat had something on it that had not been there when she left the house. Her hair was coming out of its braid. Her eyes were very clear in the lamplight. You don't have to, he said. I know, she said. I'll stay. They stayed. The second calf came easier, the third hardest of all. Just at first light, Cade's voice going low and steady in the stall, Nora behind him, holding the lamp, and occasionally the cow's head, talking quietly to the animal the way you talk to something that is afraid not to inform, but to anchor. When the third calf was on its feet and the sky outside the barn doors was beginning to go from gray to pink, They walked back to the house side by side in silence. Both of them stuffed from the hours on cold stone. Both of them with the particular tiredness that is also satisfaction, the bone-deep weariness of work that has come out right. Ruth had the stove going when they came in. She looked at them and said nothing and put coffee on the table. They sat down. Cade wrapped both hands around his cup. His hands, Nora thought, looking at them now in the morning light, without the careful, not looking she had practiced, were remarkable hands. The history of the ranch was written in them, the work of 15 years of building and losing and rebuilding. Scars from wire and blade and cold. The particular strength of hands that have learned the land they work through the specific intelligence of touch. She looked at her own hands around her coffee cup. Hers were different, the calluses in different places, the history different, but they were in the same category. Hands that knew their work, hands that did not rest easily. She thought about the distance between them on the table. She thought about Ruth's words. She thought about the shape of a choice she had been making in small increments every morning she had gotten up early to start the kitchen fire. She was still thinking about it when Cade said quietly, "I owe you more than I've said." She looked up. He was looking at his cup. "You came here to return some letters and apologize for someone else's mistake. And instead, you have done," he stopped, tried again, "the accounts, the land filing. Last night." He shook his head slowly. "I have not said clearly enough what that is worth." "You've said thank you," Nora said. "That's not what I mean." She waited. "I mean that when I wrote those letters," he said, "I was looking for a function, someone to fill a practical role. And I told myself that was a reasonable thing because this place is practical, and the life I could offer was practical, and there was nothing wrong with two people choosing each other on reasonable grounds." He paused. "And then you arrived, and you were not Violet, and you were not what I had arranged for, and you were so entirely yourself from the first moment, and he stopped again. Nora sat very still. "I did not know how to say this before now," he said. "I don't say things easily. You know that." "I know. But I need to say it correctly, so you understand what I am actually asking." He looked up from his cup finally and met her eyes. "I told you about the deed co-signature. I told you that was part of why I wanted a wife. That was true." A pause or bomb. "It is also true that in the past 8 weeks, I have come to understand that the practical reasons were a way of asking for something I was afraid to ask for plainly, because asking plainly meant it could be refused, and the practical arrangement couldn't be refused in the same way because it was reasonable and—" "Cade," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. I've known for some time." He looked at her. "I found the land documents in the 3rd week," she said. "I've had 6 weeks to understand what they meant and what you meant and what I was doing here and whether I was staying because I had to or staying because I wanted to." She looked at the table, then at him. "I've been staying because I wanted to, for longer than I've been admitting." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the morning was fully arrived, the pink gone from the sky, the light clean and direct. The ranch coming to life with the sounds of the hands waking in the bunkhouse, horses moving in the near paddock. Ruth's quiet presence somewhere in the back of the house. "There are things I want to say to you," Nora said. "Things I need to say before anything else is decided. Because I will not," she stopped, found the right words, "I will not come into something without the full truth between us. I have done that before, and I will not do it again." "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him about Thomas, not with bitterness, but plainly the way you state a fact that is no longer dangerous. She told him about 3 years of being the most useful person in a room in the least scene. She told him about Violet taking the correspondence and taking the descriptions of her qualities and wearing them like a costume, and how she had let it happen because it was easier to be useful than to be refused. She told him that she had come west ready to apologize and turn around and go back to a life she was not living so much as maintaining, and that somewhere on the road to Sentinel Ridge, looking at a hawk that was not working and not resting but just being, she had started to understand that she was tired. "Tired of being the useful one," she said, "and not the wanted one." He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You are both," he said, "to be clear." She looked at him. "Useful is not a lesser category," he said. I am not offering you useful as a consolation. I am saying that you are capable and strong, and you have done more for this ranch in 8 weeks than anyone I have paid for years and separately." Not because of any of that. I find that he paused and she could see him looking for words in the same way she did, sometimes checking the precision, making sure the statement matched the thing it was describing. I find that when I am in the same room as you, the room has a different quality. And when you are not there, I notice the absence in a way I have not noticed an absence in 3 years. Nora looked at him. I am not offering you a function, he said. I am asking you to stay because I want you here. Because this place is better with you in it, not more efficiently managed better. And I think, he paused, I think you might be better here too. But I want you to choose that, not because you have no money for a ticket home, not because staying is convenient, because you want to. The morning light moved on the kitchen floor. Nora was quiet for a long moment. I want to, she said. Something happened in his face, not a smile, not yet, but the thing that comes before the easing of something that has been braced for a long time, the slow release of a held breath. There are things that need discussing, she said. Conditions. He straightened slightly. Name them. She looked at the table, thinking, then back at him. I want my name on the deed, not as cosigner for strategic purposes. As equal holder, I have earned a share of this ground and I want it on the record. He did not hesitate. Yes, I want a proper pantry built off the kitchen before winter. The cold gets in through the current shelving, and it's inefficient, and Ruth has been managing around it for years, and she should not have to. The corner of his mouth, the left one, moved. Yes. I want to continue with the accounts, properly as the ranch accountant, not as a courtesy arrangement. If there's compensation involved, we discuss it like a business arrangement. Agreed. And I want, she stopped. This was the harder one, the one she had been carrying toward for weeks. I want you to stop protecting me from the weight of things. I want to know when something is hard. I am not made of glass, and I have never pretended to be, and I will not be managed into ignorance for my own supposed benefit. The kitchen was very still. Something passed through his face, recognition, and with it a flinching that was not weakness, but old damage being touched. And then the particular expression of a man who has been shown something true about himself and is choosing to look at it rather than away from it. That is, he said, partly a fair condition. It is the one that matters most, she said. I know. He looked at her steadily. I knew what I was doing with Ellen. I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway because I was afraid of what it cost her to know. I will not do it again. I am not the same as I was then. He paused. But I need you to tell me when I do it. I won't always know. I'll tell you, she said. I believe you, he said. And somehow that the plainness of it, the total absence of doubt in his voice, was more than anything else he might have said. They rode to Rawlins for the hearing on the 14th of May. They went together, Nora on the bay mare and Kate on the big roan he favored for distance work, the documentation in a case strapped to his saddlebag, Ruth's packed lunch and Nora's. The morning was clear and the road was dry. For the first time since the thaw, the land beginning its slow turn from winter colors to something more alive. They talked riding, not about the hearing that was prepared and ready and did not need rehearsing. They talked about other things, the south pasture fence and what needed doing before summer. A neighboring ranch family, the Kelvins, who had lost a child in the winter and were struggling. Whether the North Meadow hay would support another head if the summer grass came in strong. The practical, ordinary talk of two people whose lives had become intertwined with the same piece of ground. At some point, Nora noticed that she was not calculating the way she usually did in conversations. Not monitoring tone, not managing impressions, not keeping a careful accounting of what was owed and what might be asked. She was just talking. She was just riding beside this man on this road in this country, and it was not fraught, and it was not strategic, and it was not a performance of adequacy. It was simply what it was. The Carbon County Courthouse was a solid stone building on the main street of Rawlins, set back from the road with the bearing of a structure that takes its responsibilities seriously. The judge, a man named Callahan Spare, and careful with the dry, precise manner of someone who has heard too many arguments to be impressed by any of them, called the hearing to order at 9 in the morning. Aldous Pike was already there with 2 men from his firm and a briefcase of his own. He nodded at Cade with the stiff courtesy of an opponent who has had time to prepare for an unpleasant complication. He looked at Nora and clearly calculated her and clearly came up with the wrong number. She had known he would do this. She had dressed accordingly, not to look less serious, but to look exactly as serious as she was in the dark wool suit she had kept from Cincinnati that was neither fashionable nor apologetic. The judge went through the formalities. Then he asked for the Continental Land Company's documentation. Pike's man laid it out the 1880. Survey the competing water rights claim, the argument that the 1869 homestead filing had not adequately established the creek boundary under the applicable territorial statute. It was Nora had to concede a well-constructed argument. It had the smooth professional polish of work that had been done many times and refined each time it had encountered resistance. The judge turned to Cade. Mr. Morrow. Cade placed the survey folder on the table. Nora opened it to the 1869 documentation. She laid it flat, the signatures visible. The survey markers clearly indicated the date preceding the competing claim by 11 years. She placed beside it the county registration record, which she had obtained separately on her trip to Rawlins from the registrar's archived records, showing the original filing date in the county seal. Then she placed Ellen's notes. The judge read them. He read them carefully the way he had read everything, without expression, without comment, giving nothing away. Pike's man said from the other side of the table, "That document is not from a qualified surveyor and has no legal standing. It's an evidentiary record of witness testimony," Nora said pleasantly. "The witnesses are named. 3 of them are still in the county. One of them," she placed the final sheet on the table, a signed statement she had written to get from Hartwell on the South Quarter 10 days ago, "has provided a sworn affidavit confirming that he witnessed a survey marker on the Western Creek boundary in 1869 that was subsequently removed without his knowledge." Silence. The judge looked at the affidavit. He looked at the original survey. He looked at the date on the Continental Land Company's filing relative to the date of the survey they were relying on. "Mr. Pike," he said, "your 1880 survey was conducted by whom?" Pike said the name of the surveyor. "And was that surveyor retained by your firm?" A brief pause. "He was an independent contractor engaged for the purpose. Was he retained by your firm?" The judge said again, his voice unchanged prior to filing. Another pause. Longer. "There was a preliminary consultation," Pike said. The judge looked at Ellen's notes again. He looked at the date notation she had made beside the surveyor's fee. He set everything down, folded his hands, and looked at both parties. "The original homestead claim of 1869 establishes prior water rights," he said. "A survey commissioned by the claimant, whatever its findings, cannot supersede a prior registered claim unless there is evidence of error or fraud in the original filing. I see no such evidence." He looked at Pike. "I see, however, a credible argument that the Continental Land Company's 1880 survey may have been structured to produce a predetermined result. I will be forwarding this documentation to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review." He stamped the counterclaim. "The Morrow claim stands," he said. "Mr. Pike, I'd suggest your client find other land to improve." They walked out of the Carbon County Courthouse into the noon sun. Nora stood on the steps for a moment, letting the warmth find her. Beside her, Cade was very still. She could feel him processing not just the outcome, but the weight of it, the long years of threat ending, as cleanly and finally as a door being closed and locked. "Ellen would have been glad," he said quietly. "Yes," Nora said. "She would have liked you," he said. It was not a comparison, it was a recognition. "I think I would have liked her," Nora said. They stood on the courthouse steps in the bright spring afternoon, and the main street of Rawlins went about its business around them, and neither of them moved for a while. Then Cade said, "I'd like to talk to the circuit preacher." Nora turned to look at him. He was looking at the street, slightly awkward, in the way of a man who has said a plain thing and is not certain of the reception. "The circuit rider comes through Rawlins the first Friday of the month. It's 10 days from now. I thought—" He stopped. "If you're willing." She had known this was coming. She had known it since the kitchen that morning with the coffee, when she had said the things she needed to say, and he had heard them and answered them, and they had arrived without ceremony at something decided. She had thought about what she was willing to do. She had thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything, not quickly but fully, from all the angles she could find. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "With the conditions as stated," she said. "As stated," he agreed. "And I want to write to my mother," she said. "She should know." "Of course. And Violet will be insufferably pleased with herself." The corner of his mouth moved, the left one, the one that carried whatever warmth he permitted himself to show. "Let her be," he said. Nora thought about Violet's looping, exuberant handwriting. She thought about the letter she would write, how Violet would read it and say, I knew, and there was something there that was not forgiveness exactly, but was in the same family. Something like it came out right in the end by its own crooked road. "All right," she said, "let her be." They walked to where the horses were tied, and Cade untied them, and handed her the bay mare's reins, and they mounted and turned for the road south, and the mountains were very clear and very blue in the afternoon distance, the way they got on the best days when the air was clean and the light was at the right angle. And Nora thought, this is what it looks like from here. She had wondered on the train coming west what it would feel like to be the kind of person who just was somewhere rather than the person who managed things so that others could be somewhere. She had looked at the hawk above the ridge and envied it, its stillness, its uncalculating presence. She understood now that the hawk was not still because it had no purpose. It was still because it was exactly where it needed to be, riding exactly the current that could hold it. And the stillness was not absence of motion, but the perfect alignment of the thing with what the thing required. She was riding south toward the Sentinel Ridge, toward the work she had chosen, and the man she had chosen, toward the East Room that had learned the shape of her, and the kitchen that knew the sound of her step, and the accounts that were hers to keep. She was exactly where she needed to be. They were married on the first Friday of June in the front room of the Sentinel Ridge Ranch House, the circuit preacher smelling of trail dust and conducting the service with the brisk efficiency of a man with 3 more stops before dark. Ruth stood as witness in a dress Nora had not seen before, deep red wool with beadwork at the collar, her iron gray hair dressed with more ceremony than usual. She looked at Nora before the service began with those calm, dark eyes, and Nora looked back, and something passed between them that was entirely wordless and entirely understood. 2 of the hands were present. Tom, the youngest, kept shifting his weight from foot to foot with the suppressed emotion of a young man at his first wedding who is not certain whether it is appropriate to feel moved and is feeling moved regardless. The preacher said the words. Cade said the words. Nora said them plainly, precisely meaning every syllable. He put a ring on her finger. She did not know where he had gotten it. She did not ask then or later, though she found out eventually that it had been his mother's, kept in a small box in the back of the desk drawer, set aside when Ellen had brought her own from Philadelphia, waiting through the years of the drawer's darkness for whatever came next. It fit her hand as though it had been made for it. When the preacher had gone, Ruth put a cake on the table, a proper cake, with dried apricots and honey that she had apparently been planning for some time, and Tom, emboldened by the occasion, made a toast that was mostly incoherent and entirely heartfelt, and Nora laughed. She did not often laugh, but she laughed, and the sound of it in the room was the sound of something that had been closed for a long time opening. Cade looked at her when she laughed, and something in his face did the thing she had been watching for, the slow thawing of what had been frozen, the hard-won warmth of a man who had decided finally to let something good be good without bracing for its cost. That night, late after the house had settled and the ranch had gone quiet, Nora went to the desk in the study. She opened the land deed. She read it, the boundaries, the markers, the water rights, the long history of what had been claimed and built and fought for on this particular piece of the earth. She read Ellen's name, which was still there in the older documentation, and she did not want to remove. It had never wanted to remove it. Ellen Morrow had done her work here. Her name belonged to these pages. She picked up the pen. She added her own name in the space the clerk had indicated, her careful hand, the ink true and dark on the old paper. Nora Morrow née Calloway registered this date. The date, and below it her signature, and below that Cade's witness by Ruth, whose handwriting in the margin was as spare and deliberate as everything else about her. She blotted the ink and closed the folder and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Outside, the night was enormous and clear, the stars thicker than seemed possible, the mountains a dark shape against the dark sky. Somewhere below in the south pasture, the cattle were quiet, and the creek was running steady in the spring thaw, and the fence line held along the western boundary, where the markers stood exactly where they had always stood, established and inarguable. She had come here to return some letters. She had come here to apologize for a small deception and go home. She had come here planning to perform one difficult task and retreat to the life she had been maintaining, the careful, useful, unasked-for life of a woman who was strong enough to manage and not asked to be anything more. She had not planned to stay. She had not planned to find in the boxes of a stranger's study the evidence that his dead wife had fought alone for this ground. She had not planned to find in the daily doing of work that needed doing a place that knew how to hold her. She had not planned to find in a lean, weathered man with the eyes of a winter creek and the most careful hands she had ever seen, someone who looked at her and saw not utility, but the person that utility came from. She had not planned any of it. She thought, grateful beyond expression for the things that do not go according to plan. She got up from the desk and went to the window. The South Valley was a long, silver shape in the moonlight. The ridgelines were solid against the stars. The creek caught the light somewhere in the dark, below a brief spark and gone. It was hers, not in the simple sense of ownership, in the deeper sense of belonging. The way a thing is yours not because you can sell it, but because it has become part of the story you tell about who you are. She had earned this, not by being the right person or the expected person or the person anyone had planned for. She had earned it by showing up and doing the work and being entirely herself day after day until the place learned the shape of her and she learned the shape of it, and what had begun as a stranding became a choice, and what had been a trial became home. She was still at the window when she heard his step in the hallway. He stopped in the doorway. She turned. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for months now, with the complete, unhurried attention that had never felt like assessment and had always felt like recognition. "Come to bed," he said. Outside, the first stars were beginning to give way to the last of the night. That particular pale gray at the east, that means the day is 4 hours away and coming. There was fence to check in the morning. There were accounts to balance. There were 2 letters to write, one to her mother, one to Violet in the spring hay to assess, and the water trough on the north pasture to replace before summer. There was all of it waiting, the beautiful, relentless, ordinary work of a life. She picked up the land deed from the desk. She carried it to the shelf above the fireplace in the parlor. The shelf where the blue and white picture stood, the one small note of incongruous warmth in the spare room. She set the folder there where it would be seen, where it would be known. Then she turned and went to find him. End of part 3, closing hook. And that is the story of Nora Calloway, who came west to return a letter and stayed to write a new one with her hands, with her work, with the steady daily choice to be where she belonged. If this story found something in you, leave it a like and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? We read every one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us. There are more stories where this one came from, and every one of them is for people who know that the quiet kind of strength is still strength. We'll see you in the next one. Title: She Came to Return His Letters but Stayed to Save His Ranch. A Wyoming Love Story. 92 characters. What remains? The summer came in like a promise kept. The south pasture greened early that year. The spring rains having been generous where the previous 2 had been stingy, and the cattle moved down into the valley grass in early June with the particular unhurried contentment of animals whose world has organized itself properly. Cade watched them from the ridge above on the morning of the first warm day and said nothing, but Nora, standing beside him with her own coffee, understood the silence. 3 months ago, those cattle had been walking toward a future without enough water. Now the creek ran along the boundary the 1869 markers established, and the Continental Land Company had received a letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office that had, according to the Rawlins newspaper, prompted Aldous Pike to depart Wyoming territory for unspecified business interests in Colorado. She had read the newspaper item aloud to Cade at the breakfast table. He had said, "Good." Then he had finished his coffee and gone to start the day's work. She had loved him for that, for the absence of triumph in it, the simple settling of the thing into the past where it belonged, and the face already turned toward what needed doing next. Ruth taught her the beadwork that summer. Not all of it. Ruth was precise about what she shared and what she held, and Nora respected this without needing it explained. But the foundational patterns, the way color spoke to color, the particular patience of building something intricate from small things, one placed precisely beside another. They worked in the evenings on the porch, the long summer light going golden, and then amber, and then the particular rose gray of the high country dusk. Ruth's hands were deft and unhurried, and Nora's were not deft yet, but were learning to be unhurried, which Ruth had said was the harder of the 2 things to learn. "You have always rushed the last part," Ruth said one evening, looking at Nora's work. "The last part is where the mistakes compound," Nora said. "Or where the pattern becomes what it was always trying to be," Ruth said. "You have to let it finish itself." Nora looked at the beadwork in her hands. She thought about this study, the ledgers, the careful, methodical work of tracing what was wrong and setting it right. She thought about how she had spent her life solving the last part faster, moving through it, getting past it to the next task, the next thing that needed her. She had never, she realized, been very good at letting things finish themselves. She worked more slowly after that. The pattern that emerged was different from what she had planned, slightly looser, the colors sitting differently than she had intended. She looked at it for a long time when it was done. "It's not what I meant to make," she said. "No?" Ruth said. "It is better." Nora held it up and looked at it in the evening light. "Ruth," she said. Thank you for what you told me. At the beginning, Ruth was quiet for a moment, her hands still working. You didn't need telling, she said. You already knew. You just needed permission to know. Is that the same thing? In my experience, Ruth said it usually is. A letter came from Violet in July. Nora had written to her mother and to Violet both on the morning after the wedding, a letter that had been harder to write than she had expected. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she had found sitting at the desk with the pen in her hand that she had more to say than she had realized. She had written about the ranch and the landscape and the work. She had written about Ruth and the calving season in the courthouse. She had written about Cade not effusively, not in the language of romantic storytelling, but in the plain, truthful language of a woman describing something real. She had written, he is not easy, neither am I. We suit each other in the way that two difficult things can suit each other, which is more completely than two easy things can. Violet's reply came 6 weeks later in Violet's looping handwriting, covering 4 pages. Nora read it on the porch in the morning before the day began. She read it once through quickly and then set it in her lap and looked out at the South Valley. Violet was happy. Edmund was wonderful. Their mother was well. There was a new neighbor on the street who kept a garden that Violet admired. Edmund had been promoted, and they were discussing, perhaps maybe it was early to say, the possibility of a larger house, something with a proper spare room for when guests came. I always knew you would find it. Violet had written near the end. Whatever this is for you, you always found the right way through everything, Nora. I always relied on that too much, I know. I'm sorry for it. I hope you know how much I love you, even when I was not as good to you as you deserved. Nora read that part twice. She thought about forgiving Violet. She thought about the word itself, its shape, what it required. She thought about the letter from Thomas that she had burned, and whether the burning had been forgiveness or just the end of waiting for something that was never coming. She thought about Ruth saying, it's not what I meant to make, it's better. She put Violet's letter in her lap and looked at the valley and let the morning do what mornings do. The thing about her life, the real shape of it, the part she was still learning to see, was that it had not gone wrong when she had thought it went wrong. The wrong person choosing the wrong sister, and the sister choosing the wrong obligation in the stranding in a strange place with $11.40 had not been the story going wrong. It had been the story going exactly right by a road too crooked to see from any single point along it. She would not have chosen this road. She would have chosen a simpler one, a more direct line from where she had been to where she was now, without the years of managing and the loneliness of not being seen and the particular wound of Thomas Reed and all the rest of it. But simpler roads led to simpler places, and she was here. She picked up the letter again and read the last page. Violet described their mother's garden. Edmund's laugh. A Sunday afternoon when the light had come through the parlor window at just the right angle and everything had been exactly as it should be. Nora understood that. She understood it now in a way she had not before, the specific quality of a moment when things are exactly as they should be, when the world has organized itself rightly and you are there in the center of it, not managing it, not maintaining it, but simply alive inside it. She would write back today. She would tell Violet about the South pasture, about the beadwork, about the calves that had come in March and were now glossy and stubborn and consuming resources at a rate that was both impressive and slightly alarming. She would tell her sister that she was well. She would not say, you should have been here, not because it wasn't true, but because the thing about her particular life was that it had required exactly her and not Violet. And that was not a reproach, but just the truth of the matter, the way a sum requires specific numbers and not approximations. She folded the letter, Cade's step on the porch boards behind her. He sat in the chair beside hers, the one he had started using in the evenings, once the days were long enough to permit sitting, and looked out at the valley with the easy stillness of a man who has made peace with the particular piece of the world he is looking at. Letter from home, he said. Violet, she said, she's well. Edmund has been promoted. They're discussing a larger house. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley. The morning was just deciding what it wanted to be, the light still low and golden, the shadows long across the grass, the cattle standing in the easy quiet of early hours. Your mother, he said. Well, she asked about the mountains. Nora paused. I told her in my letter that they were larger than any picture could convey and that she should come see. He turned to look at her. I told her she could have the East Room, Nora said, in the fall, once the seasonal work is done. He was quiet, then the East Room. It's sitting empty. It's a good room. She looked at the valley. She's never been west of Columbus. She felt more than heard whatever adjustment happened in him. At that, the opening of the idea of guests of her family of the ranch having that particular ordinary warmth of a place that people came back to. She felt it the way you feel a door open in a house, not dramatically, just the change in air. Tell her to come in September, he said. The aspens turn in September. It's worth seeing. Nora looked at him. He was already looking at the valley again, with the particular equanimity of a man who has said what seemed right and has no further anxiety about it. She thought about the aspens in September, the way they would look, the high slopes going gold against the dark pine. She thought about her mother sitting on this porch in the September evening, looking at the mountains for the first time in her life. She thought about writing that letter. Thank you, she said. The fence on the south quarter needs checking today, he said. It was not a change of subject. It was just the way the conversation ended here, with the work waiting the day already organizing itself around the things that needed doing, the constant gentle pressure of the land asking for your attention. She finished her coffee and stood. He stood with her. They went off in separate directions, him toward the barn, and the day's first tasks her toward the kitchen to help Ruth with the breakfast for the hands, and there was nothing remarkable about any of it. No grand gesture, no declaration. Just this two people on a ranch in the Wyoming high country, in the summer of 1883, going about the work of a day in a life they had chosen in a place they had earned, with the particular quiet certainty of people who know, without having to say it, that this is exactly where they are supposed to be. The fence line held. The accounts balanced. The south pasture watered its cattle through the dry months, and the east room waited, aired, and ready for whoever came next. If Nora's story moves something in you tonight, the quiet kind of strength, the long road to belonging, leave a like and let us know in the comments which country you are watching from. We're grateful for every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story. Until next time.